Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Harmonious World. My name is Hilary Seabrook and this podcast is inspired by a Quincy Jones quote. Imagine what a harmonious world it would be if everyone shared a little of what they're good at. So here on Harmonious World, I chat with musicians and those who have an interest in music to get them to share what they are good at. Past guests have included those starting out in the music business as well as Grammy nominees and winners. And alongside Harmonious World, my blog contains album and live performance reviews. All the links for that are in the show notes. For this episode, I'm joined by Tom Morris, who has just written a book called Always the Music: How a Lifelong Passion Framed a Future for Orchestras. And this is a fascinating book that I think you would enjoy. But in the meantime, I hope you enjoy listening to our conversation. For this episode of Harmonious World, I'm delighted to be joined by Thomas W. Morris, better known as Tom, whose book, Always the Music: How a Lifelong Passion Framed a Future for Orchestras. And you have a history, Tom, don't you, with some of the world's finest orchestras, so you know what you're talking about.
Well, I think I do. I spent basically 35 years with the Boston Symphony and the Cleveland Orchestra. In Boston, I sort of grew up within that organization and ended up running it as the chief executive, and then I spent 16 years as chief executive of the Cleveland Orchestra. I've also since then consulted with a number of orchestras across the country, and I think I counted up about 60 of them, either consulting directly or teaching seminars. So I have a pretty good familiarity with the world of orchestras in America, really at all sizes. Although I freely admit that my bias of knowledge has been with the very big ones.
Right. Yeah. And it's really interesting. One of the first things I wanted to ask you about, because the book is very, very interesting. And what I wanted to talk to you about was what you've just touched on there about how you went from, being a conductor or, but you went onto the bureaucracy side. And I wanted to talk to you about how you manage creativity against bureaucracy. And obviously, part of that is making it pay.
Correct. Just one thing, I've done almost everything in the orchestral world. I've been the finance director, I've been the programming chief, I've been the chief executive, I've been a member, I've played a lot of percussion. The one thing I have never done is conduct.
Oh, that I completely misinterpreted that.
Yep.
That's really interesting. I think where my misinterpretation comes from is the fact that you clearly understand how an orchestra works, and that tends to come from the podium.
Yep.
It
certainly does, and the point you're making in the confusion is actually a good point, because if there's one fundamental message in what I have written and what I have come to believe, is that no matter what role you're in, it is terribly important, in fact, I would argue critical, to remember that the business these organizations are in is music. So, even as chief executive, even as finance director, I've had the great advantage, I think, of having an intense knowledge of music and enthusiasm for it, which has, of course, also allowed me to work with these amazing creative individuals that I have worked with through my life. And that really is, I think, a very important message that I'm trying to convey. I think the way I put it in the book is one of the challenges in today's world in these institutions is I think they often lose sight of the business they are in. It is about the music. And, the purpose of a performing organization, when you get right down to it, is to create transcendent experiences through music. Um,
Yeah.
that's what it's about. And I just don't understand how you can do that without having a knowledge of the product, if you will, uh, but more importantly, a passion for it.
Yeah.
Um, and so
Right. That's interesting. Yeah.
and you know that is something that has been really a hallmark through my life is this passion for music, which I talk about sort of continually. I think the line I've used is I'm a musical omnivore. Um,
Yeah.
uh, and I am. I'm always listening to music. I'm always learning about new pieces. I'm always conversing with composers and conductors and soloists about music um, because I'm just really interested in it, and it's what drives it.
Yes. One of the phrases you use is leading with the music.
Correct. Correct.
So what do you think are the challenges to these, especially the major institutions, but I think it also applies to some of the more, the smaller orchestras,
Mhm.
in terms of, what are the challenges that they're facing today? I mean, money, I guess, is always one.
Well, um, you know, to me, money is money is something that um, is a strategy. It's not a goal, um, um, because the reason you need money is to do something. So I just don't really believe that the purpose of a great musical institution is to have a balanced budget. That's a that's not a goal. That's just a strategy. That's how you stay in business.
Right. Yeah.
Uh,
Right.
um, but it's like raising money. You never will be successful raising money because you need it. You
No.
will you will be successful at raising money if you can convey an exciting purpose for which the money will be put, and something that will in fact excite the donor. Um,
Right.
so it's got to be purpose led. Um, and that's something that I have learned in my life and in whatever success I've had, which in raising money myself. Um, People get excited about what an orchestra does, or what a performance or performing organization or an artist does, and that's the fundamental transaction, at the heart of all of this. Um, and if when push comes to shove, if the concert itself that you're putting on doesn't engage people for whatever reason, um, you will not
Yeah.
be successful. Um,
No.
and 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 I guess one of the things that has struck me in all of this, and it's really because of my career. Uh, I spent 35 years with these two great organizations, the Boston Symphony and the Cleveland Orchestra. But I then spent the last third of my career not in the orchestra world, but as the artistic director of the Ojai Music Festival, which is, this very niche, if you will, uh, festival in California. It goes on over 4 days a year in early June, and it um, is very, very focused on music of today. And as the artistic director of that, not the chief executive, I officially moved to the creative side, or as I say, I crossed to the dark side. Um, uh, that put me into the midst of this amazing world of creativity with creative artists, the composers of today. Not with we didn't present big orchestras there. It was all smaller scale things. But this messy world of creativity and all kinds of music, very contemporary, some world music, some jazz, with these just astonishing artists. And I came away being bowled over by the amount of creativity in that world, and the extraordinary inventiveness of these artists. And Um, and that world completely mesmerized me. Um, and it occurred to me, having spent 16 years in that world, that um, one of the problems today is there really is no creative connection between that world and the institutionalized world of large performing organizations. And it's that dichotomy which really drove my thinking about the sort of the fundamental message of this book. That uh, that big institutions, no matter what, any big institution, whether it's an educational institution, a government,
Yeah.
uh, uh, when you reach a certain size, the bureaucracy becomes the point. Um, and it becomes very, very hard to turn a large ocean liner. And um, and this world of creativity is very nimble. And so if you're going to marry these two, it demands different thinking about how institutions are run and how they operate. Um, and the question is, how can you do that? It's very difficult, by definition. And of course, you know, at the same time that I've having these experiences and these thoughts, you know, the you know, the world of concert going was undergoing enormous change in America. You no longer had classical music education as a given in the school system. So you had people coming through school systems without direct experience with this body of work like they used to. Yeah, the schools just don't have orchestras anymore.
No.
Um, you also had, the explosion of the internet and the instantaneous availability of anything at any time for very little cost. Um, and then you had the pandemic, and the pandemic did change people's social habits. Um,
Yeah.
and so all of these things have been sort of working against the traditional model of a large symphony orchestra. Uh, and one of the results has been that attendance has fallen. People are not buying subscriptions, for 20 concerts across a whole season. That's not how they operate socially. And, if they went to 10 concerts, they're more choosy and they may go to three now. And so, um, and so you have this environmental shift going on about how audiences behave, plus the fact that the canon, the so-called canon of classical orchestral music, Brahms, Beethoven, Mahler, that is receding more and more into the past just through the passage of time. Um, and so all these things work against the future and um, with predictable results. Uh, and I find that the way not to address that is to continue operating the same way.
Right.
You have to adjust. And, there are fundamental questions about the scale of these big institutions. There's fundamental questions about the leadership of these institutions. There's fundamental questions about the governance of, how they operate in the community, the relevance of an organization to the community, which is essential for building a funding and audience base. All these things are shifting. And if you don't adjust the basic thinking of the institution, you will fall behind. That's whether it's an orchestra or anything. Um, and when I think that against this sort of situation, there's meanwhile this wildly exciting creative work going on. Um, I get perplexed. But it gives me a hint that if there's a way to marry the best elements of this exciting creative world with, the sheer performing dexterity and heritage of these great performing ensembles, there could be a really vital future. And the question is, how do you do that? Tricky, and it's hard. And that's really what I wanted to kind of talk about. And I do think that, again, my bias through my background is with the very large organizations, although I have a lot of experience with smaller ones, but my fundamental experience has been with the very big ones. But those are the organizations that every orchestra aspires to. And so, they have to set the tone. So it's a responsibility to lead. But as I said, turning a big ocean liner is just a lot more difficult than turning, a small trawler. So in a funny way, change is probably easier with the smaller organizations. But I still haven't given up. I'd love to see some of the big ones actually try and change in a much more dramatic way the course that they're on. It simply has to happen.
Right. Because otherwise they won't exist.
Um, what will happen is audiences that are declining will continue to decline. Um, and let me just say that every time I say that, make that statement, somebody will say, "Yeah, but I went to a concert of Raiders of the Lost Ark where they showed the film, and the orchestra played the score live, and it was jammed with people." True. There are always going to be special events that will attract an audience. There always have been things like that. The latest rage is live orchestral performance for movies. And it's a wonderful thing because these scores are so incredible. And to hear them played live is, it's wonderful. Um, but we're talking about 10 concerts a year over a big orchestra that plays, 150, 200 concerts. What about the basic meat of what an orchestra does week after week after week? And those concerts need to be better and more and revitalized. And that's why I spend a lot of time in the book railing about boring programming. If,
Yeah.
and and that makes me sound like sort of an elitist, guy who's obsessed with the repertoire. Baloney. Um, Audiences are really smart, and they respond if you're really creative with how you program. And I think a line that I have used, and I use it in the book, is putting on classical music concerts can learn a lot from professional sports. Now, professional sports, I don't attend professional live sporting events, but a lot of people do. And why is it that all these people, jam themselves, on a Sunday afternoon into a stadium with 40,000 other people to watch a football game? What is it that drives that? And there are probably lots of reasons, but to me, there's one critical reason, and that is they don't know how it's going to come out. There's a degree of uncertainty with the outcome. And I maintain that every concert that is produced by anyone needs to have an element of uncertain outcome. And what that means is something that's unexpected in terms of what's played, how the concert's produced, who performs, something. Because that's what energizes the experience. To go and simply hear something predictable is called commerce. Uh,
Yeah.
and art, which is what we're talking about here, should provoke a reaction. There ought to be some degree of resistance. And that needs to be done very, very subtly, very carefully, but very deliberately, um, because if you over provoke, you can create a negative reaction. But if you under provoke, you will provoke going to sleep.
Yeah.
And so I say point blank that one of the fundamental problems in the orchestra world today is simply too many boring programs. If I go to another concert where there's an opening work followed by, the Chopin Piano Concerto, followed by Brahms 4, I mean, this template of opening concerto, big romantic mark. I mean, come on, let's
Yeah.
be a little creative.
Yeah. So who does it well? So you've worked with a lot of great orchestras, but also great composers and conductors. Who now do you think is doing it well?
Well, though I say in the book that the one big orchestra in America that has, I think, very consistently um, um, been, been creative in terms of what its programming and how and what it does has been the Los Angeles Philharmonic.
Right.
And if you look at what they do, they don't just do week after week of subscription concerts, but they'll put 3 or 4 weeks together into sort of a festival, with some kind of theme through the season. Um, and they've been pretty consistent about that. And you can tie it directly to pretty strong artistic leadership, both on the podium and on the administrative side. Um, but there are others. I think one of the interesting examples today is, of all things, the South Dakota Symphony. In
Right.
Sioux Falls, South Dakota. I have a very engaging and engaged music director, a fellow named Delta David Geyer. Um, and in this little orchestra, they've got a huge program that they're doing with Dakota Indians who are in the area, a musical program, between them. They're doing in April, um, the first performance in 75 years or something of an opera by an American composer, Douglas Moore, called Giants in the Earth, which is an opera, a terrific American opera, which is forgotten, about Norwegian settlers in South Dakota. And they're making something of this in the community. And, that's just, it's energizing. Um, and I admire it deeply. Um, you know, Daring to do something unusual, and something that has meaning to who they are and where they are. Um,
Yeah.
it's uh, that ought to be something that's done everywhere. That kind of thinking.
Yeah. So you talked about the Ojai, is it? The
Oh,
Ojai Music Festival.
oh, hi, that's correct.
Ojai. Um, why do you think there are some festivals that do it really well and some organizations that do it really well, and then there are others who seem to be wanting to stay the same and wanting to do the safe stuff?
Mhm. Um, Ojai is an interesting case. You know, the Ojai Music Festival is over 75 years old. It was founded in the 40s. It takes place over one weekend um, in this little town, Ojai, California, which is northwest of Los Angeles, up in the mountains. Um, Probably one of the most beautiful places on earth. Um, and it's always had it's always been um, devoted to the sort of principle that it looks at music from the standpoint of today. I maintain it's not a contemporary music festival, but there's a lot of contemporary music there. But there's also a lot of old music. But it looks at music from the standpoint of today. And it has an unusual structure, which has been there right from the beginning when it was founded, where it has, uh, a multi-year artistic director, which is the job I had. And the artistic director's job was each year to hire a different partner. We called it music director, and that could be a conductor, a composer, an instrumentalist, whatever, with whom to fashion that particular 4-day festival. Um, um, and the list of those people who have occupied that position through the years is just extraordinary. I mean, it includes Igor Stravinsky. you know,
Wow.
it includes Pierre Boulez. Pierre Boulez was the music director of Ojai in his life 7 times, um, and so uh, it was the notion of musical vitality and looking at music from the standpoint today was embodied in who was there and what they did. I mean, it's real. It's not a marketing slogan. It's real. And what's interesting to me about it is that um, the transaction with the audience in Ojai has always been the idea of what Ojai stands for, the festival stands for. It stands for adventure, surprise, unusual, um, very, very high quality. So that's what is sold. What's not sold is come tomorrow and hear, so and so play, be the soloist, or so and so conduct. It's the idea of Ojai, because the institution stood for something that you could and should communicate. It's it's a principle that I was fortunate to learn in my life and career very early in my first job in Boston with the Boston Pops of all things.
Oh, right.
And that's why I spend quite a bit of time talking about the Boston Pops in my book. And the conductor, the 50-year conductor, Arthur Fiedler. Um, they didn't sell concerts or, greatest hits programming or soloists. They sold the idea of the Boston Pops. They never announced programs ahead. You came to the Boston Pops. And Fiedler, who was this brilliant character, colorful indeed, but brilliant. Uh, I learned programming from him and how you program a concert, albeit with him it was light classical music and not contemporary music. But the notion that when you build a program, you pay attention to the narrative arc of how the pieces flow together and how you work uh, in generating audience reaction and continuity, how you build uh, crescendo and climax of experience. Um, and I learned that from the master, Arthur Fiedler. And it's exactly the same principle that I applied when I was doing programming with these two great orchestras and when I was doing programming with Pierre Boulez in Ojai. You pay attention to that. You have different tools depending on what the principle was. But to me, the notion of an institution standing for something and having a point of view is the most important thing that I've learned in my career. And it is the key to success. Otherwise, you find yourself reduced to, well, we have to do Beethoven 9 because it will sell tickets. Um, no, you should do Beethoven 9 because the orchestra and the conductor have something to say about it.
Right.
And I mean that sounds kind of lofty as I say it. It's actually a very simple principle.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it is. It's brilliant. Overall, would you say that you are optimistic about the future of orchestras? I mean, are orchestras going to continue to exist? Because they're very expensive beasts, aren't they?
They're very expensive beasts. And the answer is sure, they're not going to go away. But I I don't think we may not have as many. We may not have them producing as many concerts. They may be doing other things. They may be diversifying. There will always, don't get me wrong. I love Brahms Symphony Number Two, you know, but but I don't love Brahms Number Two because it's familiar. I like it because it's an interesting piece, and I love hearing what a great conductor um, um, and a great orchestra will do with it. What makes an interesting interpretation? I'm I'm manic about comparing performances between artists, but I'm also really interested in what you program before Brahms too, uh,
Right.
and because um, you know what happens in a concert, and it's why I like a lot of music of today. I'll use an example. Um, if you're going to do Mahler Symphony Number One, for example, to play a Mozart symphony before it is predictable and it's fine, nothing wrong. There's nothing magic. Um, I would rather hear something very contemporary in front of Mahler one because it will actually make me listen to the Mahler differently. Um, and again, I'll give you a real example. I programmed in Cleveland Shostakovich 10th Symphony at a concert once, and the piece on the first half was a viola concerto by the great Russian composer Gubaidulina. A very new piece, a very angular piece, difficult piece to listen to. And I remember the intermission of the concert, two subscribers, supporters of the orchestra cornered me uh, individually, saying, well, that's what's wrong after hearing the Gubata. That's what's wrong. Say, why do you insist on programming pieces like that? Just nobody likes them. It's terrible. You should stop doing that. And I listened and I said, okay, would you like me to respond? Yes. And I said, well, first thing is I respect your opinion about the Gubanolina. If you didn't like it, that's absolutely fine. But don't say everybody doesn't like it, because I know people who did. So talk about yourself in reacting. Second, Shostakovich's 10th Symphony was written in 1954. It's a masterpiece, but it's also angry, loud, and rough. It's not pretty. And if we did a Mozart symphony before it, you would probably come to me after and say, well, I like the Mozart. I just didn't like that Shostakovich. It was just too noisy. Well, one of the reasons that we did the Gubaidulina was to frame the anger of the Shostakovich in a different way, so you'd listen to it differently. So, come and see me after the concert, what you thought of the Shostakovich. And then the second person came in. We had the same conversation. After the Shostakovich, the two people came up to me separately. One said, you're right. I loved that Shostakovich. I didn't think I would, but it made me listen differently, and I figured, great. The second person said, well, I hated the Shostakovich also. You win some and you lose some. But I think you have to listen to music in not in isolation, a piece of music not in isolation, but in relationship to other music, other times, other situations. And so how you provide the context is really critical. And that can be done with the program, or in the case of a festival like Ojai, where people come to the whole thing by the succession of programs that you put together.
I think that's the joy of music. The fact is that it doesn't exist in isolation because you're different each time you
Correct.
listen to it.
And if
Yeah,
you have, if you have a bad day and you go and hear a concert, you'll hear it differently than if you have a good day. I mean,
exactly.
it's and that's the great thing about music. It's a great thing about art. Um,
Yeah,
it's a relationship between the music through the performer and the person hearing it. And great um, production of concerts, people who promote concerts, produce concerts, which is what I did. That's the thrill, is you have to pay attention to every little element of how you produce a concert, I think. It's not just what's played, but it's what the pacing of the concert is like, the program, the lighting on the stage, every little thing. Uh, and um, and that's enormous creative fun. And the greatest joy I have had in my life is producing concerts and managing those variables, for 50 years. I mean, what fun is that?
absolutely. Fantastic. Oh, it's been such a pleasure talking to you, and I really enjoyed. I read the book and I really enjoyed it.
Great. I'm glad. It was fun to do.
Yeah, I bet. I bet. You've got a lot of history and memories to kind of go back over and kind of make sense of.
Well, I tried. It, when I decided to write this, the reason I wrote the book was there was some things I wanted to say, which are basically in the penultimate chapter. That's what I sort of had in my head that I needed to say. But as I thought about how to do that, I realized that I couldn't do that without framing it again using what I've been talking about, the context of my own life and how my own views have changed over time through these incredible experiences with music, but also with these amazing individuals that I've had the honor to collaborate with and who are friends. And I mean, I think that one of the lines I use is I've had, the most incredible personal faculty that you can imagine to, teach me about all this stuff. And if anything, I urge more creativity and imagination in in dealing with these institutions in the future, rather than less. It's so easy for people to say, "Well, that won't sell." Well, you don't know if that won't sell. You may have some indication of why that didn't sell in the past, but let's use the example of Gustav Mahler. Gustav Mahler, nobody had ever heard of in the early 1960s. And it was really thanks to the continued advocacy of Leonard Bernstein in particular, and a number of others, that uh, that turned the music of Mahler into unknown to, audience favorites.
Yeah.
Um, and it's music that resonated with turbulent times. Um, uh, so I I simply don't believe that you find audiences. You don't, when you sell concerts, you don't sort of wait to see who's going to. You have to build audiences. You have to engage them. You have to bring them along. Um, and again, going back to my sports uh, metaphor, uh, um, you need to have, a degree of surprise in everything you do, the unexpected, because that's what thrills people. Gosh, I like that. But wow, I didn't expect that.
Yeah. Yeah. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Tom, for your time. I'm really grateful.
Well, it's my pleasure, Hillary. I've enjoyed our conversation.
I hope you enjoyed listening to that conversation with Tom Morris. Very, very interesting man with some very interesting perspectives on the future of orchestras. So thank you for joining me once more for this episode of Harmonious World, and I hope you have a very good week. Thank you for listening to the latest episode of Harmonious World. My name is Hilary Seabrook, and it's a great delight to bring this series of discussions with musicians and composers and writers and all sorts of people to you. Obviously, there's no point in having a podcast if people aren't listening, and I'm very grateful to my listeners for doing so. Thanks also to Joe English for composing and performing this new theme tune. So wherever you get your podcast, you can leave a review. You can share this with your friends and family, either as a link or on social media and that sort of thing. I'd be really grateful for that. Don't forget that you can subscribe now. There's a link wherever you get your podcasts. So have a great week, and please remember why I started this, which is just to try and make the world a little more harmonious. Thanks for listening to Harmonious World.